Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I'm here with part 2, right, of my August wrap-up. I'm actually posting these in 2 parts because I read way too many books to fit into 1 month, so here is the second part. I will of course link part 1 down below, and in case you can't read my t-shirt, it's the last public words of Inez Milholland, which are, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? I've been reading some nonfiction books about the women's suffrage movement, one of which I will talk about today. So the next book that I finished in the month was Furyborn by Claire Legrand. This is a dual timeline fantasy novel, and in the older timeline, we are following a main character named Riel, and she has these powers that seem to indicate she is destined to either be the Blood Queen or the Sun Queen. So whether she's going to save the world or doom the world, and she has to compete in these trials in order to prove which one she is. And 1,000 years later is our other timeline, and we follow a main character named Eliana, and in her time, Riel is known as the Blood Queen. So obviously something happened in that previous timeline or story. And Eliana is an assassin, and her storyline involves getting much more involved in politics than she wants to be. She just wants to kind of protect her family and do her own thing and not get involved, but she ends up, of course, becoming involved. And this has very, very mixed reviews, and I unfortunately really didn't like it. The only things I did enjoy are the opening chapters. I think were stellar. Or maybe it's just one chapter. Really liked that. I thought I was gonna love the book when I read that chapter, and unfortunately I didn't. I also really liked some of the side characters. Like Riel has a friend in particular who I really liked, and I also ended up enjoying the trials and like magic scenes a lot more than I thought. Those were also in Riel's storyline. Unfortunately, I didn't really like anything else. I was kind of bored for Riel's storyline, and Ileana's actively irritated me for like 90% of it. Ileana was a really frustrating character to follow. She pretty much had 2 speeds. Those were try to have sex with the problem or try to punch the problem. And that was it. That was like her entire arsenal. And for somebody who's supposed to be so clever and such a survivor and so like brilliant and always 2 steps ahead of everyone, it was kind of ridiculous. And I know that there are readers who enjoy her kind of archetype a lot more than I do, so that might be part of it. But I think that even if you like that kind of character, I'm not sure how you would feel about it here because it's so repetitive. Like that is literally the only thing to Ileana's personality is sex and fighting people or like trying to fight people. And it just made her chapters really repetitive, and for a really long book, that was a problem. I also didn't like the actual plot or story. I did find it really predictable, but that actually didn't bother me like it sometimes does, because it was kind of like the satisfying, like, I like to be proven right, so that's fine. And there were so many other things that I didn't like about the book that really didn't register as a problem to me. The things that I didn't like about the plot are that it was just boring. There was so much traveling in Ileana's chapters, and obviously that's not something I enjoy. Like, just nothing seemed to happen in the story. Everything was dragged out longer than it had to be. I also really didn't like the romances in this book. Riel's just I was not a fan of. Her love interest seemed pretty bland. Their scenes together were not good. And on Ileana's side, I kind of predicted it, but there were some things about it that just felt weird. And also I just didn't like her as a character, so it was hard to get invested in various relationships involving her. And then another problem with Ileana, you can probably tell she was one of my main issues with this book. I found it so hard to care about her at all and about what happened to her, because I don't feel like this book could make up its mind about what kind of character she was supposed to be. Like, we're kind of introduced to her as like, she's this ruthless assassin who only cares about her family, and is not gonna do anything else, which, okay, I am not drawn to characters like that. If I had known that was the kind of character she was, I might not have picked this book up, but that's fine. That's what we get going into this book. But then that's not really what happens, because consistently throughout the book, she goes back and forth about feeling super conflicted about all these people she's killed, and then being like, I don't care about anybody, I just care about myself and like 2 people I'm related to, which got really annoying really fast, especially because then she would get upset about the outcome of her own actions and act like it was not her fault. Like, there's one scene at the beginning of the book that really bugged me, because she was not only like an assassin, she would like track down people who were helping others escape this really horrible empire, and she would get them caught and like lead them to their execution, essentially. I'm sorry, I realize I've been calling her an assassin. She's technically a bounty hunter, but her actions directly lead to the deaths of the people she's chasing, so I feel like she's kind of both. And she's also very willing to kill people, so I kind of feel like she's both. But anyway, so like there's a scene near the very beginning of the book where she helps get somebody caught who has been helping people escape this horrible empire. And there is like no problem in Ileana's mind about the dissonance between doing that and also her plans for finally escaping her situation and getting her family out, relying on the same people that she's catching. Like, she has all these plans about how they're gonna like bribe somebody to like smuggle them out of this country. And I'm like, well, that's not gonna go so well, Ileana, because you have been helping get them murdered. And it was just that kind of short-sightedness and like stupidity that really, really got on my nerves. Plus, like I said, just throughout the book, she kept going back and forth about like, one second she'd be like super conflicted and it seemed like she was developing a conscience, and then like literally the next scene, or sometimes the same scene, she'd be like, well, I don't care about anyone. I only care about my family. None of the rest of you matter. I'm not going to lift a finger to help the rest of this like oppressed group of people because it's not in my best interest. So yeah, really hard to care about her. There were a lot of other things I didn't like about this book, as I mentioned, and I ended up giving Furyborn 2.5 stars. My next Tome Topple book, thankfully, I enjoyed much more, and that was The Dark Days Club by Alison Goodman. I was really kind of hesitant about this one because I read Eon by this author and really, really didn't like it, but this was a really different story, so I was hopeful about it, and I actually kind of loved this. I enjoyed this book so much more than I expected. This is a paranormal / urban fantasy historical book. It takes place in, I can't remember the year, 1812 is when it takes place in England. We follow our main character, Lady Helen, and she's kind of doing her best to fit into society as a proper lady. She's living with, I think, her aunt and uncle because her parents were actually killed. She's an orphan, and she's kind of doing her best to fit in with all the rules of society. But these signs start piling up about how there might be something different about her. Actually, in this world, there are these supernatural creatures that like look like humans, and they kind of like feed off of human energy. So she ends up getting caught up in that and solving some mysteries and like learning more about this world and about her family and herself. And I really loved this. I really, really enjoyed Lady Helen as a main character. I feel like this book could have so easily been a not like other girls situation, but it wasn't. Like, Helen doesn't look down on girls who enjoy dresses, and she actually doesn't hate them herself. There are some aspects of fitting into society that she doesn't enjoy, but it never feels like to be a real feminist you have to hate other women kind of thing, or you have to feel this certain way about feminine things. And I just really enjoyed Helen as a character. She was really smart and really determined, and I really felt for her as she was trying to figure out this world that she had been kind of thrust into. I also really loved her maid Darby, who like they kind of develop a friendship as the story goes on. And I feel like with a lot of these kind of historical set books, we will have kind of a maid or like working class character who's like the friend of the heroine, and sometimes that can feel kind of underdeveloped or a little bit like, I don't know, like sometimes I think the classism of the era is not handled in the best way, but I feel like this one did a better job with it. I really liked Darby, and I feel like she's going to be an even more important character in the later books, which makes me really happy. I also really liked the writing of this. It felt like period appropriate, but it was also just really engaging, and I just think the writing was really well done. It was just very enjoyable to read, and I also thought the historical setting was done brilliantly. I thought the plot was super engaging, and another thing I think is really cool about this book is I think it does a lot of common things uncommonly well. Like we have the heroine who suddenly realizes she might have powers, but that's done in a really thoughtful way. I think that the moments of Helen realizing that something about her is different, I think those were done in a really interesting and clever way. We also have the kind of like brooding love interest or potential love interest character who is Lord Carlston, who's the one who kind of like recruits Helen and starts like kind of introducing her to this world. And he was not like a brooding like jackass. Like, I actually really liked him. He had good reasons for being the way that he was, and he didn't treat Helen badly or like she was stupid, and use like his like tragic past as an excuse to do that. So I actually really liked him. I also thought the historical obstacles of this setting were handled in a way that felt very believable. Like, there are several times where Helen has to go to a lot of trouble to get around social rules in order to like assist with what's going on with the plot or the conflict, because a lot of the people involved in this kind of secret society are men, and they don't really have the understanding or care to have the understanding about how much more difficult it is to like accomplish these things if you're a woman. So there's like a part where they set up a meeting at this inn or something, and they're like, oh, meet us there, to Helen, and she has to go to all this trouble to like sneak out and get there and make sure that people don't see her like meeting a single man at this inn. Like, all these things that the male characters didn't have to think about, and Helen does, and I feel like that was done in a really believable way. So yeah, I just really, really enjoyed this book. I gave The Dark Days Club 4.5 stars, and I'm really excited to continue the series. Next, I finished The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. This is the first book in the Mistborn series, which a ton of people know about. So just very briefly, in this world, the form of magic is known as allomancy, and it involves people ingesting and burning metals in order to use certain abilities. And if most people can only burn one, but if you can burn all of them, you are known as a Mistborn, and that's a very big deal. Our main character is a girl named Vin, and she is a Mistborn, and she kind of gets recruited. Like, this book is really interesting in that it's set in a fantasy world after the bad guy has already won. And so our group of characters are trying not to stop him, but to overthrow him. Like, the bad thing has already happened, which was really interesting. And I really liked this overall. I don't think I enjoyed it quite as much as a lot of people seem to, although I have really loved Brandon Sanderson's books in the past. I think this actually ended up being my least favorite that I've read from him so far, but it was still very good. I loved Kelsier. He's one of the other important characters, and I kind of expected to love him based on things I had heard about him, but predictably I did. He was great. I also really liked Sazed. He's a side character who I thought was really interesting, and just like I really liked him. He was very enjoyable. I also liked Elend, even though like he wasn't super well developed, but his like character archetype is one that I just find very endearing and enjoyable, so I really liked him. I really liked the political stuff of the story. Actually, when I started getting really engaged with this book is when we actually started getting into the political machinations of the story and not just this heist plot. We were spending more time with characters and more time understanding, like I said, the political intrigue of this world. I really liked that. And once again, I feel like Brandon Sanderson really excels at endings. I really liked the ending of this book. I thought it was brilliant. There were some things I didn't love about this book, and the biggest one is Vin as a main character. I just feel like she was really not well developed. She's one of those characters where like you could replace her with a potted plant and I probably wouldn't notice. She just had no personality, I feel like, and it was hard because she's also really integral to the story. Like most of the plot kind of hinges on her like developing her powers and like going on adventures and things. So while there were quite a few supporting characters, many of whom I enjoyed, it was kind of hard to have such a dull character be the central focus of the book. Although I would argue that Kelsier is almost a main character, if not another main character, so that was nice. I also didn't love the setting of this book. It's kind of an industrial fantasy, which is not generally something I enjoy, and I didn't really like that here. And then also, so I liked the allomancy magic system. I thought it was really clever and it was just very interesting to read about, but I think sometimes that detracted from my enjoyment of the story because like the scenes where characters are using allomancy, like where they're fighting with it or just using it to accomplish things, are so minutely described that it got really kind of hard to follow or just boring. Like I understand why we had that level of detail, and at the beginning I needed it to kind of understand how things were working, but it got to a point where we would just have like several paragraphs of descriptions, like especially when we got into the more like complicated uses that characters were like using metals for. It just got to be a lot because it was just long paragraphs describing kind of repetitive scenes of characters like using this metal and like pushing off of this object and doing things like that, where like a lot of people I think would probably enjoy that. I found it kind of a drag to read sometimes, but overall I did really like this book. I gave it 3.75 stars. I'm definitely going to continue the series. I can see why a lot of people love it. I've also seen a lot of people say that this is a really good Sanderson book to start with, and I know a lot of people have had really good luck starting with this one. I personally am glad that I didn't start with this one because again, it's my least favorite, and I feel like it doesn't like show off his skills as an author the best necessarily. It's also not his most unique book, I feel like, outside of the magic system. But like I said, still really enjoyed this. Next, I finished The History of White People by Nell Irvin Painter. This is a nonfiction book about whiteness as a construction and how it has kind of changed over the years. And it focuses mainly on the United States, but it also involves quite a lot of Europe because a lot of European racial theory is what inspired developments in the US, and Painter also does like trace some of those things in Europe, so a lot of it does involve the US, but I think even if you're not American, I think this would be a really useful and interesting book, and I thought this was really well done. It's kind of told through like short biographies, which I found really interesting. So Painter would like kind of identify a person who had an important theory that would become useful for things like racism or eugenics or ethnocentrism, things like that. So she would give some background on that person, kind of explain their theories, and kind of trace how that influenced policies or influenced like other events in the United States or other countries. I also think this book did a really good job of showing how groups who are already oppressed or disadvantaged in some way will still look down on and will still oppress people beneath them. Like we saw that with, for example, Irish and Italian immigrants who were very much looked down upon and were considered non-white when they first got to the United States. As a way to bring themselves closer to this ideal of whiteness, they participated in anti-blackness, they engaged in racism themselves, even though like they were considered to be not white enough and things like that. The big focus of this book is how fake the construct of race and whiteness is, and how it's like based on pseudoscience, and like seeing how people developed these like branches of study around something that is not even real is just really interesting. And that's not to say that racism doesn't exist, I want to be clear about that, but the actual like biological differences between races are not a thing, and race is a thing that humans made up, and this book does a really good job of exploring that. I also think Painter did a really great job of putting like certain people or certain developments into context and kind of tracing how like even hundreds of years ago, when the majority of people were really big into like certain racist theories or like eugenics or things like that, Painter would show how even back then there were people who knew that this was not right and who were doing things to combat this. And even if they weren't doing it in the most progressive way or the way that we would do it today, it was really interesting to see how like not everybody thought that way. Like basically that's not an excuse to say like, oh, well, back then everyone did that. no, not everyone did. Like, for example, she talked about how Ruth Benedict was really important in the field of anthropology because she was one of the first kind of mainstream anthropologists who started talking about respect for different cultures and the fact that race is meaningless, and kind of bringing those ideas to a wider audience. And even though her work is not perfect, like, she still had some biases in her work, she still had some prejudices, but she was really important. And I think Painter did a good job of calling out the places where she did not do so well or where she failed, while also showing how like progress was being made, development was being made. Actually overall, like especially the end of this book was a lot more hopeful than I kind of expected, and sadly, I think that's partly because this was published in 2010. So even though racism in America was still very much alive and well in 2010 as it is today, I think the fact that it was published in 2010 is partly why some things end on a more hopeful note. Like, this was before the election in 2016. I do think there were some chapters or segments that were harder to follow or that were drier. Like the first few chapters in particular were a real slog to get through. And I think partly they were supposed to be because like she was showing, the Painter was showing how like these different like Roman ethnic groups, and how like later scholars would claim to be part of this one, but like this name didn't actually mean what it was supposed to mean, and like nobody really knew how to classify this group, which kind of proves that this system of classification was ridiculous. Like part of it was supposed to be, I think, dry and confusing, but just like the first couple chapters where it's just like strings of names of like old Roman Empire ethnic groups, it was kind of hard to get through and kind of confusing. And throughout the book there were definitely some chapters that I think were denser than they maybe needed to be, or than other chapters in this book were, because I do think this is a nonfiction book that is intended for like not just scholars, but like more casual readers of nonfiction. But that being said, this is still a really important book with lots of great information, really well researched, and definitely interesting for most of it, and I gave The History of White People 4 stars. Next, I finished New Poets of Native Nations, which was edited by Heidi Erdrich. This is an anthology of various indigenous poets, and I really liked this. I thought this was a really good sampling of different styles, and I also think that you got enough from each poet that you could kind of like get a feeling for their work. Obviously it's not a ton of their work because I think there's like 21 poets in this collection, so there's quite a few in here, but I thought it was a really great way to try out a bunch of different indigenous poets, find some that I really enjoyed and wanted to read more from. And I think the way that Erdrich chose her poets, I think one of the criteria for being included in this anthology is that they already had published work, which I think is great because if you find someone you love, you can go out and find more of their work right away. And in case you're curious, my favorite poets that I read were Layli Lang Soldier, Tommy Pico, Laura Daw, Brandy Nalani McDougall, M.L. Smoker, Leanne Howe, Karen Wood, Eric Gansworth, and Janet McAdams. So I'm really excited to check out more of their work, and as a whole I gave this collection 4 stars. Would definitely recommend it. Next, I finished The Boundless by Anna Bright. This is the sequel and concluding volume to the Beholder duology. I actually have a full spoiler-free review for the first book, which I will link down below. And this obviously continues on from the story of the first book. So in the first book, Sela kind of gets pressured or forced into going on this tour to try and find a consort to help her govern her homeland of Potomac. This is set in, it's like slightly alternate history but slightly fantasy sort of world. It's definitely kind of like soft focus magic and world building, which I talk about in that review. So if you like to have things like hard and fast and defined, this might not be the series for you. But I actually really liked the way it was done. She's going on this trip to try and find somebody that she loves enough to marry and to bring home and to help her rule Potomac. At the end of the first book, something pretty significantly changes, and she ends up in this sequel, she ends up venturing into a much more dangerous area called the Imperia, and she has kind of become involved in, again, political intrigue and things going on. And she ends up having to decide if she wants to take a larger or more active role in that. Across these 2 books, we have really seen Sela coming into her own, which I have really enjoyed. And I have like kind of mixed feelings about this second book. There were a lot of things I really loved about it and a few things that I didn't so much. So like I said, I have really loved Sela's arc and character development. She was a little naive in the first book, but for very understandable reasons, and I think she feels believable as a teenager while also going through these situations that kind of naturally help her become a more confident person. I also really loved the female friendships in the second book. That was one of my only criticisms of book 1, is I wish there had been I wish there had been more female characters and more interactions between those characters, but I think that was really remedied here. And I also really love the use and focus on fairy tales and the power of stories and why storytelling is important. That's just something that speaks to me very deeply, and I really love the way this series focuses on that. However, there were a few things I did not love about this sequel, and quite a few of those are personal preference. So I was really not happy with the romance, the way the romance ended up in this series, and that is a like somewhat significant part of the story because, like, again, based on the premise. Like when the first book finished, I kind of didn't have a preference with who she ended up with. I thought like the various options were pretty well developed, and I just was like ready to see who Sela ended up with, if anybody. But unfortunately, in the interim between reading book 1 and reading book 2, which was pretty soon after it was published, I apparently developed very strong feelings. I was like, actually, I do care who she ends up with, and I'm gonna be really sad if it goes a different way, and my streak of picking the wrong love interest is unfortunately unbroken because things did not go the way I wanted them to in this book, even though there were certain things that I think were set up to be a certain way. And it wasn't just that I didn't love who Sela ended up with, it was also just that she like thought and talked about him so much in this book, like a lot. And I understand that especially with the situation Sela was in, she would obviously be thinking a lot about the person that she loves and who she wants to be with, and she wishes that he was there and all of this. Like, I get that, but I think it was still more than was necessary. Like, it was really, really frequent throughout this book, and that got pretty annoying. I also think Lang as a character is just frankly unnecessary. Like, I didn't care about him that much in book one, but he was fine. In this one, he actually irritated me. There's one thing in particular that I think we were supposed to find very sweet, and I actually found it a little bit creepy. But even outside of that, I just think he was an unnecessary character, and he was really annoying, and I didn't really care about the conflict or the potential resolution between him and Sela. Like, I just didn't really care about any of their interactions. I didn't know why they were important people in each other's lives. And also, I think that Alexei as a character was so underutilized in this book. Especially given the way the plot goes in this one, I think Alexei was set up to be such an interesting character and to be a lot more prevalent in the story than he was. I just really liked him in the first book. I thought he was so interesting, and I feel like he was shortchanged here, and that made me really sad. He was kind of an afterthought, which was weird because I feel like we were set up for him to be pretty significant in this, like at least in parts of the story. So yeah, as you can see, I'm like kind of conflicted about this series. I think I would still recommend it, especially if you end up liking a different love interest than I did. You would probably be a lot happier. But I really love the writing. I really love the world building. I talked about the themes. I thought Sela's character development was great. There were just some like specific choices, I guess, with the second book, especially related to which characters were most important or got more page time and like the romantic angle and everything. So I ended up giving the Boundless 3.75 stars. So I did overall really enjoy this series despite those hangups, and I'm really excited to see what Anna Bright writes next. Next, I finished A Good Kind of Trouble by Lisa Moore-Ramey, and this is a middle grade contemporary novel, and we follow our main character Shayla. And Shayla has always been pretty quiet. She doesn't like to draw attention to herself, and her sister Hannah has always been very outspoken, especially about political and human rights issues. She's very active in the Black Lives Matter movement, and even though Shayla believes in the rights that they're fighting for, she doesn't really think that this movement is for her necessarily. But after she becomes involved in a protest that leaves a very powerful impact on her, Shayla starts to reconsider. She starts to think more about how she can use her voice and the things that she stands for, and when you need to speak up to do what is right. And then in addition to that, Shayla's also dealing with some friendship conflict at school. One of her friends seems to be drifting away or not wanting to spend time with her and her other friend anymore, so she's going through that. And I really loved this book. I thought this was so well done. I think it's so important that we are seeing middle grade books about activism. I thought Shayla's or Shay's character development was done really well. Seeing her better understand what she stands for and what is worth fighting for was just really well done. I also thought the friendship conflict was done really well, because I feel like a lot of times in books where there is a friendship fight, you can kind of tell from pretty early on how things are going to go. If like the friends are going to make up and it's going to be a story about like forgiving each other and like working through conflict, or if it's going to be a story about like letting go of people in your life who hurt you or who are not good for you, and you know the friends are going to stay broken up. I feel like that's usually something that's pretty easy to tell or spot from early on, and I couldn't tell with this book. And also I couldn't really tell what I wanted to happen with this book, because there were some moments where I felt like really hopeful that Shay and her friends could work things out, and there were some times where I'm like, Shay, I think you're better off without this girl. So I just think that part was really well done. And also, in addition to this book handling the Black Lives Matter movement, there were a lot of other kind of issues or important topics that this book also deals with, like sometimes in really small ways, but just really effectively. Because one of her friends is Latinx and one of her friends is Asian, she starts getting accused of not being black enough, or thinking that like she's too good to have black friends. So there's this discussion about like what black enough even means, and people making judgments. There's also some talk about consent in this book. One of the characters is kissed when they don't want to be, and even though other characters kind of tried to brush it off as being not a big deal, they end up telling the person who did this like that wasn't okay and you shouldn't have done it. And I just feel like that's a really great thing to see in a middle grade novel. There's also discussion about how different groups experience racism differently, like some discussions with Shayla and her friends that I just think were really well done and did it in a way that felt natural for young kids to talk about. also dealing with these really important issues. And I also loved the family dynamics in this book. Like I said, the friendship was really well done. I just think this book did so many things so well. It was very nuanced, and it had really important messages, themes that were handled really well and not in a way that felt heavy-handed while still being appropriate for a younger audience. And I just really loved Shayla and her story, and I gave A Good Kind of Trouble 5 stars. Next, I finished Bad Girls Throughout History, 100 Remarkable Women Who Changed the World by Ann Shen. And this is a nonfiction book that talks about 100 women in history who did really interesting and important things and who are kind of known as being bad girls for that reason. And I adore Ann Shen's illustration style. You can see it from that cover how beautiful her art is. And we have a really good balance of older historical figures and more modern ones, some that were really well known and some that aren't as much. So I really liked that. For example, I really want to learn more about Fanny Farmer. I will link some information about her in the description box because I just think she sounds super cool and I want to read more about her. And I had not heard of her before this book. But I did have some issues with this book. One of the big ones is I think this book was really confused about what it was trying to do. Like, generally, I've read quite a few of these feminist nonfiction compilation books by now, and pretty much they fall into one of two categories. One is admirable women from history, so women that we should celebrate and emulate and things like that, or they're interesting women from history who maybe did important or significant things, but who are not always the best role models. And of course, books can do like combinations of those, but they're always very upfront about like what they're trying to do. And I think that's good. I think it's good to talk about interesting women from history while not glorifying them just because they're women, like not saying like that they're role models just because they were women. It's like if they did terrible things, just because they're a woman, it doesn't mean we should like celebrate those terrible things they did. And this book, I think, did not do that very well. So Bad Girls Throughout History is the title, so you might think that it was leaning more on the side of maybe women who weren't the best role models, but who were interesting or important. But the introduction says, "This is a book about women. This is a book about girls who had a ton of fear and personal flaws and faced insurmountable obstacles, but did amazing things anyway." So it's like, okay, they're not gonna be perfect people, obviously, but for the most part, we should admire what they did. She continues, "When I first started this project 5 years ago, someone remarked that the title of this book didn't make sense, that none of these girls were bad, that axe murderers were bad, not Harriet Tubman. Yet she escaped slavery and snuck into the South 19 times to illegally free slaves. To be a bad girl is to break any socially accepted rule." And then she goes on to give examples of that. So from the introduction, Ann Shen comes out and says, these are good women who broke rules or social conventions for really good and important reasons. But that's not the kind of women she profiles. Like, some of them are, but quite a few of them are not. So like, for example, Susan B. Anthony has a profile in here with absolutely no mention of the fact that she was actually very, very racist. Like, yes, she did a lot for the women's suffrage movement, but in other ways, she was not a great person. And it's like, you can still talk about the important things she did, but I think especially nowadays we're recognizing that you can't separate that from the other things that she did, from the harm that she did. So I'm like, why wouldn't you mention both things, like the good and the bad? Queen Elizabeth I is also in here, and Ann Shen praises her for being religiously progressive, which is just wild to me. Like, maybe near the beginning of her reign compared to other monarchs, maybe that was true, but later on she was having people tortured and executed for not being Anglican or for not conforming to Anglicanism. So that's definitely not what I would call religiously progressive. I think most people wouldn't call it that. And also just something I think was really weird is Marie Curie is in here, which is great. No mention of the fact that she died from what she studied, which was radium and polonium. She died from radiation. So like, there are just some things that were left out of this book that I think were really glaring and really odd. And I know they're short biographies, but they're things that are important enough where I'm like, this should have been included. You could have had at least 1 or 2 sentences about this, and it wasn't done. So I'm really torn about this book because the majority of the biographies I think were done really well, but there were some of those glaring issues I had that I think this book did not handle well. So I'm really conflicted about this. I think on Goodreads I have it at 4 stars right now because if we're just going by numbers, most of these biographies I think were well done, but the ones that weren't, like, really bothered me, so I don't know if it should be closer to like 3.5. I don't know. I'm conflicted. I do think this book is worth reading, but just keep in mind that some important information is left out, and also that I think this book is really misleading about what its purpose is, or maybe just confused about what its purpose is. Like, I don't know if Ann Shen like realized how different the actual book ended up being from her introduction, but anyway. Next, I finished The Reluctant Queen by Sarah Beth Durst. This is the second book in the Queens of Renthia series. It's a companion sequel that starts pretty soon after the first book, and this was a buddy read with my friend Huck from Badger Reads, linked down below as always. This was a very mixed reading experience. It was definitely quick to read, and in some ways I think it was a lot more engaging than book one. There was kind of a like mystery element, which I didn't expect there to be, this like whodunit plot, and I actually really liked that. That was one of the things that I think kept me so engaged in this book, even when I was frustrated with other aspects. I also continue to really like the world in this story. I realize I haven't told you anything about what this book is about. So this is set in a fantasy world where there are these nature spirits, and they have to be constantly kept under control, because if they're not, they will kind of go wild and kill humans. That's like the thing that they want to do, is kill humans. So humans and these spirits have like a very tentative, not even a truce really, they're like barely not fighting each other, and the queen is really important in that. And so the second book starts off with the queen being very sick, and she very quickly has to try and find a replacement to take over, because the role of queen is kind of the most important defense in keeping these spirits under control. And so our main character in this book is Naylin, and she lives a very quiet life with her husband and children in the forest, and she's really, really good at this spirit magic, but she doesn't really want to be. She doesn't want to draw attention to herself. She doesn't want to be caught up in politics and danger and being in a position of such responsibility. She doesn't want to bring this danger and conflict to her family. She just wants to be left alone. But Ven, a character that we know from the first book, he's kind of a trainer of these champions who have the potential to become the queen. And so he seeks out Naylin because he thinks she's the best shot that they have at finding somebody who is the queen, at finding somebody who can be the queen and keep everyone safe. So like I said, I like the world. I think the concept of this world is really interesting. I did enjoy the mystery and some of the plot aspects. I also mostly liked Naylin as a main character, and I really liked Ven. I was a little frustrated because I think a lot of the book's earlier conflict could have been solved by people just being specific when they told Naylin things, like about why she was needed to be queen. And like, I understand there were some things that they couldn't tell her or they didn't feel comfortable telling her, but there were still ways to communicate to Naylin why she was so important and why her decision to not get involved in any of this was kind of selfish. Like, there were ways they could have done that, and the fact that they didn't for a long time did bother me. There were also some side characters and side plots that I just really hated. Huck and I were both annoyed by them. Just again, people not communicating about why a particular character was dangerous, or like just being specific. I did also like Naylin's kids. I feel like young kid characters in books are very hard to do well, but I found them like really funny and engaging, and I just really liked Naylin's family dynamic. Like, her relationship with her kids was just really sweet and just fun. And then in addition to the other things I found frustrating, some of the plot of this book was also just really annoying. Like, I enjoyed the mystery stuff and some other stuff, but yeah, some of the decisions characters made or some of just the directions the story went, I found very annoying, and I just, yeah, had very mixed feelings about this one. I gave The Reluctant Queen 3 stars, and I do not plan to finish the series. I took a water break and just spilled water all over my t-shirt, so that's fun. The next book I finished was Race to the Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is in the Rick Riordan Presents imprint, and it deals with Navajo mythology and folklore. Our main character is a girl named Najone, and her brother is named Mac, and they start finding out some things about their family and how they may actually be descended from the hero twins from Navajo folklore, which means that they have powers, and also that they kind of have a responsibility to fight back against this villain who seems to be targeting their dad, and he also has these sinister plans for his company and the rest of the world. One of the themes in this book is about environmentalism, which I thought was really cool, and this was a really clever way to explore that. And so we follow Najone and her brother Mac and Najona's best friend Davery as they go on an adventure to try and figure out what they have to do to save their dad and also save the world. And I really liked this. I really liked the folklore and the like actual story of this book. Like, the plot I found really interesting, and like I said, I think that the way Rebecca Roanhorse used Navajo folklore and used this story to talk about things like environmentalism and being eco-friendly and like big corporations and things like that, I thought that was really clever. I also really liked a lot of the characters, the side characters, especially like Mr. Yazzie. I always love an animal companion, and he was really fun. And also the people that the main characters meet along the way who are from Navajo stories and folklore. I just really enjoyed that. Spider-Woman was a particularly interesting and fun character, I thought. The only thing that I didn't like so much about this book is the writing itself. There was just something about the style that didn't quite click with me, but overall I really, really liked this. I have read Trail of Lightning by Rebecca Roanhorse and a couple of her short stories that were in anthologies, and this is definitely my favorite thing that she has written, and I hope that she writes more middle grade. And I gave Race to the Sun 4 stars. Next, I finished Rogue Princess by B.R. Myers, and this I listened to on audiobook actually while reading along in the physical copy, which is something I hadn't done before, so that was interesting. And it was narrated by Lucy Brownhill. And this is a Cinderella retelling that is science fiction. It's set on a different planet, and I would definitely call this like lighter sci-fi, which I actually enjoyed. That's something I tend to like. And it's dual perspective. We follow one character who is Princess Delia, and another character who is named Aiden. He's kind of in like the poorer area, and Delia is being expected to marry one of the suitors that is staying at the palace, and she's also kind of dealing with her royal obligations and all of that. And Aiden, meanwhile, is just kind of trying to get by and survive. And he also lives with his horrible stepfamily, so that's another thing that he's dealing with. And of course, Aiden and Delia's paths cross, and they develop a romantic relationship. And I thought this book was pretty cute. It was fine. Some of it was really fun. This was kind of like a middle of the road book for me. I did find Delia very likable as a main character, and I also liked that she took her responsibilities seriously, her duty to take care of the people that she was in charge of. I like that she was trying to find a way to stay true to herself and what she wanted, while also keeping in mind that a lot of people depended on her, and that she had a real responsibility as the leader of this planet or of this kingdom. I also thought her sister was a really fun character, and there were some elements of the plot that I was pleasantly surprised by. There were some like turns that I didn't quite see coming that I thought were really interesting, and that made the story a lot more interesting. I didn't really like Aiden's chapters as much though. I just found him a less compelling character, and his story was not as interesting. I did think some of the romantic scenes were kind of cute though. I think especially because the way the narrator read them, I think that was really fun. I just didn't find him as interesting. A lot of times I was kind of bored during his chapters, and I would just say that overall this book was kind of forgettable to me. Like I'm having a really hard time remembering like what the story was, like what even happened outside of some like a couple of big things, and I know that I'm like really behind on wrap-ups, so that might be part of it. But I also just think that this book was just kind of like like it was fine. It was good for me. I gave Rogue Princess 3 stars. Next, I finished Mr. President, How Long Must We Wait? Alice Paul, Woodrow Wilson, and the Fight for the Right to Vote by Tina Cassidy. And this is kind of a dual biography that also traces a lot of the history of the 19th Amendment, or that like portion of the women's suffrage movement in the United States. We learn a lot more about Alice Paul and Woodrow Wilson and their interactions, like their kind of rivalry, I guess you could say. And I liked this book overall. I had some issues with it, which I'll get into, but I did really like learning a lot more about Alice Paul and like specific details about her life and work that are not always covered in the like bullet point format that we get history in a lot of times. It was also kind of interesting, if somewhat infuriating, learning more about Woodrow Wilson. Definitely not a big fan of his, and I feel like in school, like at least in my school, we kind of like glossed over him a little bit. Like he wasn't one of the really bad presidents, I guess, but he also like wasn't that great, but we gave him a lot of credit for like the 14 points and like League of Nations that the US didn't even join and things like that. So I just feel like he's shown in like a slightly positive light when we learned about this era, and I don't think he deserved that. He was not good about racial justice. He had to be like forced into supporting women's right to vote, and he just like overall strikes me as one of those people who does have some principles but not many, and also the ones that he does have, he kind of has to be like forced into doing something about acting on them, and when he does, he tries to make it sound like he's been in favor of it all along. And yeah, so it was really irritating to read about him sometimes, but it was interesting. And I think one of my favorite things about this book was just the level of detail about events during this period that aren't covered a lot. Like I've been reading and watching a lot of resources about the women's suffrage movement and like the 19th Amendment and the things it accomplished and didn't accomplish. And so there are some things in this book that are talked about a lot, like the suffrage parade that Alice Paul organized at the same time, or almost the same time, as Wilson was supposed to be inaugurated, or was like getting ready to be inaugurated. So she kind of like stole the thunder from him deliberately. And a lot of sources talk about that, but like this book actually goes into like some of the parade floats and like who participated and why certain things were significant and stuff like that. And just like overall, I think the level of detail this book gave about history, like events and people that are usually covered in pretty broad strokes, I think it was really valuable for that reason. I did find sometimes the writing to be kind of weird or confusing. Like I feel like the author would insert like weird personal details in the middle of a more factual paragraph. And I do think this book did a good job of being like approachable kind of biography. I think that was great. But it would be like in the middle of a sentence, she would reference the color that like Wilson's eyes were, or like she would talk about specific things that Alice Paul was like feeling or like thinking about at a moment where I'm like, how would you know that as a biographer unless she like said this in a letter or something? So just things like that about the writing I didn't love. And I also think that Tina Cassidy could have done a lot more to talk about the racism within the women's suffrage movement. Like she did refer to it a few times and talk about it a little, but I think she could have done a lot more with that. Like, I think she could have gone into more specifics, especially when she was talking about some of the Black women who were involved in the movement. Like, I know that this is primarily a biography of Alice Paul and Woodrow Wilson, but throughout the rest of the book, we do get kind of little snapshots of other people who were important. So I think she could have easily done something like that with some of the women like Ida B. Wells or Mary Church Terrell, who are really important in the women's suffrage movement and who still suffered from racism. So yeah, I had the kind of mixed feelings about this. Overall though, I would recommend it. I think it's a good resource, especially for very specific uses like I talked about, but there are definitely things that it could have done better. And I give this book 3.5 stars. And finally, the last book I finished in August, I technically finished after midnight. So this was technically in the early hours of September 1st, but I'm gonna still talk about it here. And that is The Deep by River Solomon with David Diggs, William Hudson, and Jonathan Snipes. So there's like a whole interesting history about how this story came about. I'll link some information on that down below. Because it is really cool, and I think it does give some interesting perspective on this story. So this is a really short novella, and we follow our main character Yetu, and she is a mermaid, and she's specifically a mermaid who, her and her people are descended from African slave women who were thrown overboard pregnant during the Middle Passage. So during the crossing when slaves were abducted or sold from Africa and taken to America or other colonies. And Yetu is the memory keeper for her people. So what this means is she holds all of their trauma and all of their memories. And I think once a year maybe, everybody gathers together and Yetu kind of gives back these memories so that they can experience them and learn about their history and think about their history. And then she takes them all back. But this time when our story starts, Yetu is so overwhelmed and this process and this carrying of these memories is starting to destroy her from the inside out, and she can't take it anymore. So she gives all of the memories back to her people, but she leaves before she can take them back. So the rest of the story is about what she does from there. And so we follow Yetu after she leaves, trying to flee from this responsibility that is destroying her. And this story deals a lot with trauma, and especially generational trauma and the toll that memory takes, but also how getting rid of memories or ignoring memories is also maybe not the way to go. This is such a short story, but it's so thematically rich. I think this book does so many things so well and so thoughtfully. I think the themes were done really brilliantly. I really liked Yetu as a main character. Like, I think River Solomon did such a good job of making you understand why Yetu had gotten to this point and why she couldn't take it anymore. And I really felt for her. You were really invested in her trying to find a way to survive herself, but also to continue to help her people. And I surprisingly also really liked the other kind of point of view chapters or like backstory chapters, because we get little bits of the history of Yetu's people. And then throughout the story, we kind of see in more detail other events that happened or other memory keepers or other parts of history about how Yetu's people came to be. And I actually really liked those. I don't generally like flashback chapters, but I think those were done so well. I think they felt really coherent with the story as a whole, and they really added up to this full and rich story in such a short amount of pages. It did take me a little bit to get into the writing style, but after a while I liked the writing a lot more. So I don't know if the style actually changed or if I just kind of adjusted to this writing style. And I also think that the ending of the story was a little bit abrupt. But other than that, I thought this was a fantastic story. I think it's a really important story that deals with a lot of heavy topics and themes, but is also a really well told story. And I gave The Deep 4 stars. Okay everybody, so those are all of the books that I read in August. I am really hoping I will be caught up on wrap up soon. We will see. Please comment down below and let me know if you have read any of these books, what you thought of them, or if you're going to pick them up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!